Sometimes you hear about these historical turning points, and they just sound kind of unbelievable at first.
Yeah.
That's the vibe I get from this whole presidential amnesty program in Nigeria's Niger Delta.
Mm-hmm.
You sent a ton of material on this.
I did.
So clearly, it's piqued your interest.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about a region that's grappling with poverty and environmental damage.
Yeah.
Despite being rich in oil.
Yeah.
Like it was a powder keg, right?
Absolutely. The Niger Delta is a textbook example of what happens when resource wealth doesn't benefit the local population.
Okay.
And that's where the amnesty program comes in.
Right.
It was a really bold attempt to shift things from conflict to peace and development.
Yeah, help me wrap my head around this. We're talking about actual militant leaders.
Yeah.
Guys with names like Topolo and Ateke Tom.
Yeah.
Agreeing to lay down their arms.
Mm-hmm.
What made them say yes to peace after years of fighting?
Well, it's important to understand the context. These groups weren't just fighting for the sake of fighting. They were protesting exploitation of their land and resources. They were protesting the lack of basic services and the environmental damage caused by the oil industry.
Right.
So the amnesty program offered a potential way out, a chance to trade bullets for a better future.
But promising a better future isn't always enough.
No.
How did the program actually work?
Well, it was based on a model called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR for short.
DDR.
It's a framework used in post-conflict situations to help transition ex-combatants back into civilian life.
I see.
So think of it as a 3-step process.
Okay, so step 1 is disarmament.
Right.
I imagine that wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't.
How do you convince heavily armed groups to give up their weapons?
Well, the program offered a combination of incentives, cash payments, promises of training and education, and a chance to actually participate in rebuilding their communities.
Okay.
The government also really emphasized the negative impact of continued violence and offered a path to reconciliation.
Okay.
And surprisingly, it worked.
Wow.
Thousands of militants across the Niger Delta accepted the amnesty offer and surrendered their weapons.
That is a massive shift.
It is.
But didn't some critics say that this just created a situation where the government was essentially paying off militants?
Yeah, that was certainly one of the criticisms.
Okay.
Some argued that it rewarded violence and set a dangerous precedent.
Right.
Others pointed out that it was a more pragmatic approach to ending a conflict that was really crippling the oil industry and causing widespread suffering.
It sounds like a classic dilemma.
It is.
Weighing short-term gains against long-term consequences.
Yeah.
What happened after the militants disarmed?
Well, that's step 2.
Right. Step 2, demobilization.
Exactly. Demobilization is all about separating ex-militants from their past lives.
Okay.
And helping them prepare for reintegration. Okay.
They were moved from their camps, registered and provided with temporary housing and support.
I see.
This wasn't just about logistics.
Yeah.
It was also about changing mindsets.
Yeah.
They needed counseling and reorientation programs to help them adjust to a completely different way of life.
Yeah. Can you imagine going from a life of armed struggle to, well...
It's hard to even imagine.
Whatever came next. It must have been a huge psychological adjustment.
It was a massive shift.
Yeah. So who was in charge of managing this whole complex process?
Well, several figures played key roles.
Yeah.
But two that stand out in those early days are Timi Alebe and Kingsley Kuku.
Okay.
Alebe was deeply involved in the initial negotiations, really building trust with those militant leaders and persuading them to accept the amnesty offer.
Okay.
Kuku then kind of took the reins, coordinated the disarmament and early reintegration efforts. He really focused on providing basic needs like food and shelter,
while also setting up programs for education and vocational training.
So they've laid down their weapons.
Yes.
They're getting support.
Right.
But they're still in limbo.
Yeah.
That's where step 3 reintegration comes in.
Exactly.
What did that look like on the ground?
Well, the goal was to equip these ex-militants with the skills and resources they needed to become productive members of society.
Okay.
Some were eager to go back to school, pursuing education they'd missed out on because of the conflict.
Right.
Others were more interested in vocational training.
Yeah.
Learning practical skills they could use to find jobs in fields like construction, agriculture, or even the oil industry itself.
Wait, the oil industry?
Yeah.
Weren't they just fighting against that very industry?
It might seem ironic, but remember their grievance was with the unfair distribution of oil wealth.
Right.
Not necessarily the industry itself.
Okay.
So some ex-militants saw an opportunity to use their knowledge of the region and their networks to build legitimate businesses within the oil and gas sector.
So it's like they were saying, we know how things work here, and now we want a piece of the pie. But this time, legitimately, was this bullets to business idea actually successful?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
We'll dive into some specific examples in a bit.
Okay.
But first, it's important to understand that the reintegration phase wasn't without its challenges.
Okay, like what?
One of the most significant was the government's decision to provide monthly stipends to ex-militants.
Oh, that was meant to be a temporary safety net.
Right, yeah.
Like a way to help them get back on their feet.
Exactly. But the problem was that these stipends continued for years.
Right.
And some argued that they created a culture of dependency instead of actively seeking work or building sustainable livelihoods.
Right.
Some ex-militants became reliant on these handouts.
So instead of being a springboard to a new life, the stipends became a kind of crutch.
Exactly.
That seems to go against the whole point of empowerment, right?
Okay. It does. It became a real point of contention. Critics argued that it undermined the program's long-term goals.
Okay.
And let's be clear, sustainable development was a central aim.
Right. Sustainable development in this context means
development that meets present needs without compromising the future.
Got it.
Yeah.
So things like environmental protection, economic growth that benefits local communities, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But you can't just snap your fingers and make sustainable development happen, right?
No, you do. It takes time.
It sounds like a long and complicated process.
Absolutely.